I pulled into the lot beside Hale Marine just to grab my tide charts. Nothing more than that. It was a Tuesday in late October, and I'd told myself I was done second-guessing every errand, done overthinking every small decision the way widowers do when they suddenly have too much quiet in their lives. Margaret had been gone 14 months. The Marina was still mine, even if Marcus handled the day-to-day operations now. I had every right to walk in unannounced. That's when I saw my nephew Thomas's truck parked in the slip behind the main office. The one with the cracked left taillight I'd been telling him to fix for 2 years. Thomas lived in Portland. Thomas had told me at Sunday dinner 4 days ago that he was heading to Portland for the whole week. A roofing job, he'd said. Big contract up north. I sat behind the wheel and stared at that truck. 67 years of living on this coast had taught me one thing above everything else. When something doesn't fit, it's usually because someone put it there deliberately. I should have driven away. Margaret would have said, "Bobby, don't go looking for trouble." But Margaret wasn't here, and something in my chest pulled me toward the side door. My key still worked. Marcus had asked me once, gently, whether I wanted to hand it back since I'd stepped away from daily operations. I'd said no. He hadn't pushed. The hallway smelled like salt air and old wood, the way it always had, the way my father had built it to smell 40 years ago. I moved quietly past the equipment storage toward the back office. The door was half open. I heard voices before I reached it. Marcus was speaking, low and certain. "The estate attorney already has the draft ready. Once the conservatorship goes through, we don't need the old man's signature on anything." Thomas laughed. "You really think Claire will go along with it?" "She doesn't have to go along with it. She just has to not fight it." Marcus paused. "I've been planting seeds for 6 months. The confusion, the checkbook thing, the time he forgot the dock lease renewal. She thinks she's watching her father decline. She's not going to stand in the way of protecting him." "What about the waterfront parcels?" 32 acres. Thomas, we are sitting on 32 acres of Massachusetts coastline. Do you understand what Portland Development will pay for that once we have authority over his assets? Marcus's voice had taken on something I had never heard in it before. Something that had no warmth in it at all. He's been coasting on this property for 20 years, while it doubled and tripled in value. He doesn't even know what he's sitting on. "He built this place with his own hands," Thomas said, and I couldn't tell whether that was admiration or just a fact being stated before it was set aside. "And now we're going to finish what he started. That's all this is." I stood in that hallway for perhaps 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes. Then I turned around and walked back the way I'd come, through the side door, across the gravel lot, and into my truck. I sat there with the engine off and watched a cormorant land on the dock railing and stare at the water. I envied it. It had no son-in-law. It had no nephew. It had no 32 acres anyone was trying to steal. I drove home to Rockport. I drove the long way, along Route 127, because I needed the water beside me while I thought. Inside the house I'd shared with Margaret for 38 years, I stood at the kitchen counter and made 2 phone calls. The first was to the Essex County Registry of Deeds. A woman with a patient voice told me I could request certified copies of all recorded documents under my name and under Hale Marine Properties, LLC within the last 18 months. I told her I'd be there first thing Wednesday morning. The second call went to a man named Dennis Farrell, a private investigator out of Salem whose card I'd gotten from my accountant 2 years ago during a dispute with a contractor. I'd never used it. I'd kept it in the desk drawer, the way you keep things you hope you'll never need. Mr. Farrell answered on the second ring. I told him I needed to know what was happening with my company, my property, and the 2 men who worked inside it. He asked me one question: how long had this been going on? I said I didn't know yet. "That's what I need you to find out." Wednesday morning, the registry clerk spread 26 pages across the counter and waited while I read them. By page 6, I needed to sit down. By page 11, I was glad I had. A limited liability company called Coastal Legacy Holdings had been registered in Delaware 8 months ago. The registered agent was a firm in Wilmington I'd never heard of. The 2 listed members were Marcus Webb and Thomas Hale. My nephew, who shared my last name, who had stood at my wife's graveside and wept. By page 19, I had found 4 deed transfers. The north parcel, the boat storage building and surrounding acreage, the mooring field lease rights, and a right-of-way easement that controlled access to the entire southern waterfront. All 4 had been transferred from Hale Marine Properties, LLC, into Coastal Legacy Holdings. All four bore my signature. I had not signed those documents. I had not been in an attorney's office. I had not authorized anything. The dates ran from February through August of that year. I thought back through those months. Margaret's estate settlement, the dock repair, my hip surgery in March, 2 weeks of recovery at home, a stack of papers Marcus had brought to the house. He'd set them on the side table next to my water glass. Get well cards, he'd said. Partnership renewals, routine stuff. I'll walk you through the important ones. You just need to initial a few things. I had initialed a few things. I met Dennis Farrell at a coffee shop in Gloucester on Thursday morning. He was quiet, deliberate, the kind of man who let you talk until you'd said everything before he said anything at all. He studied the deed copies and the LLC registration for a long time without speaking. Then he turned his phone around and showed me a photograph. A purchase order from the Marina's main supply account, dated 7 months ago. Among the items, an executive signature stamp, custom engraved, R. Hale. I hadn't ordered that. Dennis put the phone down. Mr. Hale. A stamp like this gets buried in a stack of routine supply orders. Someone at the business level with account access orders it the same way they'd order dock cleats or invoice paper. By the time it arrives, it's just another item in a box. Nobody checks twice. I stared at my coffee. I built that business from one slip and a used engine hoist. My father started it, and I spent 30 years expanding it. My daughter grew up on that dock. Margaret kept the books for the first 12 years in a spiral notebook. Dennis's voice was steady. I know. And they knew you trusted them. That's the mechanism. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned over at least a year. And based on what you've told me about the conservatorship conversations, they're not done. They're about to move to the next phase. What do I do? First, we find out exactly what's been transferred and what hasn't. Second, you get a cognitive evaluation immediately from a doctor with no connection to anyone in your family or your business. Third, you find yourself an elder law attorney today, not tomorrow. He leaned forward slightly. Mr. Hale, when they file for guardianship, and I believe they will file soon, you need to already be 3 steps ahead of them. The cognitive evaluation was scheduled for Friday. I drove 40 minutes north to a practice in Newburyport, a neurologist named Dr. Andrea Choi, who had no idea who Marcus Webb was or that my Marina existed. She was precise and unhurried. She told me at the end of 3 hours of testing that my memory was intact, my executive function was normal, and that I showed no clinical indicators of dementia or cognitive impairment of any kind. She also told me, carefully, that evaluations can be contested. If someone had found a physician willing to say otherwise, there would be conflicting testimony. Judges had to weigh competing expert opinions. I understand, I said. Saturday afternoon, my daughter Claire came to the house. She brought Helen, my granddaughter, who was 9, and ran straight to the kitchen because she knew I kept animal crackers in the cabinet above the microwave. That detail, the cabinet above the microwave, that was Margaret's system, and I had kept it. Claire sat down at the table and looked at me in a way she had been looking at me for the past several months. A careful look, a measuring look. Dad, she said. Marcus mentioned the estate planning documents. She stopped. Bernard Phillips's firm. Sent something? That caught me. I hadn't told her about the documents yet. Hadn't told anyone. I asked her how she knew. He mentioned it casually. Said Bernard had sent over some updates. That it was just routine. She was watching me carefully now. She added, Dad, have you read them yet? I'm reviewing them, I said. I'll speak with Bernard before I sign anything. Something shifted in her face. I couldn't read it then. I stored it away. Sunday dinner. I kept Margaret's tradition because stopping it felt like losing the last thread. Pot roast. The good plates. Helen set the table and put the forks on the wrong side, and I didn't correct her because Margaret never corrected her either. Marcus arrived with a bottle of wine and a manner that had always seemed like warmth and that I now watched differently, the way you watch a river differently once you know there are rocks beneath the surface. Thomas came too. He sat across from me and ate 2 helpings and told a story about a job in Portland that I now knew had not existed. After dinner, over decaf, Marcus cleared his throat. He had practiced this. I could see the practiced quality of it now. Dad, he said, there are some things we've been wanting to discuss as a family. He looked at Claire, who looked at her hands. We're worried about you, Thomas added. They laid it out carefully. The checkbook error from March, $200 transposed in my register. The dock lease renewal I had briefly forgotten. A conversation at Thanksgiving where I'd apparently repeated a story I'd told 20 minutes earlier. Each item had been noticed, recorded, kept. We've spoken with Bernard, Marcus said. There are some documents that would give Claire and me the ability to manage things on your behalf if anything should happen. If or when, I said. Marcus frowned. Excuse me? You said if anything should happen. I've heard that phrased a different way recently. Silence settled over the table. Helen had gone to watch television in the other room. Claire was very still. Dad, Thomas said, this is exactly the kind of thing that worries us. You're reading into things that aren't there. I looked at my son-in-law and my nephew and kept my voice level. I would like to speak with Bernard personally before signing any documents. That's all I'm saying. Marcus stood and began clearing plates. His movements were controlled, tight. Of course. Nobody's rushing you, Robert. After they left, I stood at the sink and washed the good plates by hand, the way Margaret had always done. Warm water and gentle pressure. My phone rang. Dennis Farrell. They filed this afternoon, he said. Emergency guardianship petition, Essex County Probate Court. Petitioners are Marcus Webb and Thomas Hale. Hearing is set for December 9th. I set the last plate in the rack. December 9th, 22 days. Monday morning, I met with Susan Park, an elder law attorney in Beverly whose name Dennis had given me. She had handled 31 contested guardianship cases. She had won 28. She told me the other 3 still bothered her, and she intended to keep it that way. She walked me through what would happen in court. They would present a pattern of alleged decline, supported by an affidavit from a physician named Dr. Gerald Morse, whom I'd seen once, 14 months ago, for a routine blood pressure check in the weeks after Margaret died. She told me grief presentations could be documented in a way that looked like cognitive decline to a non-specialist. She told me it happened more than I would think. She also told me something I hadn't expected. Mr. Hale, the waterfront parcels. If they gain guardianship authority, the property sales don't need your signature. They can execute the transfers as your legal representatives. Based on the current coastal development market, we're talking about somewhere north of $40 million for those parcels. $40 million. My father had paid $1,100 for the original lot in 1961. I'll fight it, I said. I know you will. She looked at me steadily. But I want you prepared. This will require you to stand in open court while your son-in-law and your nephew testify that you are no longer capable of managing your own life. I understand. Good. Because that's exactly what we're going to let them do. The second week moved in sharp, distinct pieces. Dennis found the full paper trail, 14 months of systematic transfer, all building toward the moment when Coastal Legacy Holdings would hold controlling interest in everything Hale Marine had ever owned. A Portland development firm called Atlantic Crest had already been in preliminary discussions with Marcus for 6 months. The intended sale price was $43 million. Dennis also found something else. A purchase of 2 round-trip flights to Grand Cayman, booked under Thomas's name, departing December 11th, 2 days after the scheduled guardianship hearing. Dennis explained what that meant without me having to ask. Tuesday of the second week, Claire called me. Her voice was careful, deliberate. Dad, can we meet? Just us. She paused. No, Marcus. We met at a bakery near her office in Gloucester on Wednesday morning. She was there before me, both hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and she looked like she hadn't slept in some time. Dad, she said, I have to ask you something first, and I need you to answer me honestly. Go ahead. Do you trust me? I looked at my daughter. She had Margaret's eyes, Margaret's way of going still when something mattered. I said yes. She reached into her bag and set a small external hard drive on the table between us. Then a manila folder, then a second folder. I've been watching Marcus for 8 months, she said quietly. Something Mom said to me before she got sick. Something she noticed in the way Marcus talked about the property, about your age, about the future, she said. Claire, your father is going to need someone who's paying attention. She made me promise. I stared at the hard drive. There are emails on there, Claire continued. Recorded phone calls. Bank records showing where money has been moved. There are photographs of documents that never came from Bernard Phillips's firm, documents Marcus created and had notarized using a stamp ordered through the Marina account. She swallowed. I attended 2 of their planning meetings. I told Marcus I wanted to be part of it. I let him believe I was on his side. Claire, I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry I had to let you think I might not protect you. Her voice caught. After they filed the petition, they asked me to testify. I told Marcus I would. I understood then what she had done, what it had cost her to sit at my Sunday dinner table and look uncertain, to let me wonder about her. I reached across and put my hand over hers. You did what your mother asked. She nodded, and for a moment she was 12 years old again, and Margaret was standing at the stove, and the marina was full of summer boats, and none of this had happened yet. There's something else, she said. She pulled out a business card from the folder. His name is James Whitmore. He was Mom's personal attorney, separate from Bernard. She set up an account with him 18 months ago. She told me about it in the hospital. She said he was holding something for her, and that I'd know when it was time to tell you. That evening, I called James Whitmore. His voice was measured and careful. He told me that Margaret had come to him 6 months before she died, that she had left something in his care, sealed, with specific instructions. It was to remain sealed unless Robert Allen Hale's mental competency was formally challenged in a court of law. I'll be at the hearing, he said. December 9th. Essex County Probate Court in Salem. Susan Park met me at the entrance at 8:45. The courthouse was old granite, built in a century that believed in permanence. Inside, Marcus and Thomas were already seated at the petitioner's table, with a man I recognized as an attorney from Andover. Bernard Phillips sat behind them. When Marcus saw me walk in with Susan at my side, something moved across his face. Something that wasn't quite confidence anymore. All rise. Judge Patricia Alderman was in her early 60s, with the kind of expression that gave nothing away and missed nothing. She reviewed the petition, reviewed my response, and looked up. I see the respondent is present and represented by counsel. She looked at Marcus's attorney. Your client filed an emergency petition citing immediate risk of harm. Yet Mr. Hale appears to have engaged competent legal representation and presented himself before this court without apparent difficulty. Marcus's attorney stood. Your Honor, the petitioner's concerns center on a documented pattern of cognitive decline that may not be immediately apparent in... Let's proceed, Judge Alderman said. Marcus took the stand first. He described the checkbook error, the forgotten lease renewal, the repeated Thanksgiving story. He had notes. He was smooth and sorrowful, and he looked at me once with an expression that was meant to read as loving concern. I had seen that expression across my dinner table for 11 years. I knew now what was behind it. Susan cross-examined him. Mr. Webb, isn't it true that you have been an officer of Hale Marine Properties, LLC for the past 4 years? Yes. And in that capacity, you have had signatory access to company accounts? Yes. And you approved the supply order that included a custom signature stamp bearing your father-in-law's name? A pause. I may have signed off on that order, yes. You may have. Susan let that settle. No further questions. Dr. Andrea Choi testified by video. She walked the court through every evaluation she had administered, every test, every result. Her conclusion was unambiguous. Mr. Hale demonstrates no clinical impairment of any kind. His cognitive function falls in the normal to above average range for his age group. Dr. Morse's written statement was entered into evidence by the petitioners. Susan immediately requested the right to submit Dr. Choi's full evaluation as a competing expert opinion. Judge Alderman granted it. Then Dennis Farrell presented his findings. The deed transfers, the signature stamp, the timeline, the LLC registered in Delaware. The $43 million development deal already in preliminary negotiation. The flights to Grand Cayman booked for December 11th. The courtroom was very quiet by the time he finished. Judge Alderman had been writing steadily. Susan said, Your Honor, I'd like to call the petitioner's co-petitioner, Thomas Hale, to the stand. Thomas took the stand and looked at the floor. He answered questions in a voice that had gone flat. When Susan asked him whether he had signed the documents registering Coastal Legacy Holdings, he said yes. When she asked him whether he understood that those documents had been funded in part by deed transfers bearing a forged signature, he said he wanted to speak to an attorney. Judge Alderman told him that was his right and that this court would be happy to pause these proceedings while a criminal inquiry was initiated. Marcus's attorney stood and immediately requested a recess. Judge Alderman denied it. Susan called Claire to the stand. Marcus watched his wife walk to the witness box. His expression moved through surprise, then recalculation, then something that had no name for it in a courtroom. "Miss Hale Webb," Susan began, "you were asked by your husband to support this petition." "I was. And you agreed to support it?" "I told him I would." Claire's voice was steady. "I told him that because I needed him to believe it." She reached into her jacket pocket and set the small external hard drive on the railing. "Your Honor, this contains 8 months of documentation. Emails, recorded calls, photographs of documents produced using an unauthorized signature stamp, and bank statements tracing funds from Hale Marine Properties, LLC, into Coastal Legacy Holdings." Judge Alderman looked at the drive, then at Marcus. "Is that all?" Susan said to Claire. "No." Claire looked at me, and for a moment the whole room fell away, and it was just the two of us. Mom told me to watch. She told me 6 months before she died that something didn't feel right about the way Marcus talked about the property, about Dad's future. She said I should watch and document and not say anything until there was enough to matter. She looked at her husband. After Mom died, I kept watching. When Marcus asked me to be part of the plan, I said yes, so I could be in the room. I sat in those meetings and I took notes and I recorded what I could, and I waited until the right moment. Thomas had his face in his hands. "Did you know about the Grand Cayman flights?" Susan asked. "I found out last week." Susan turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I have one final witness." She nodded toward the back of the courtroom. The door opened. A man in his early 70s in a gray suit entered with a worn leather briefcase and a sealed envelope. James Whitmore introduced himself to the court and explained the arrangement Margaret Hale had made with him 18 months ago. A sealed testament, to be opened only if Robert Hale's mental competency became the subject of formal legal proceedings. Judge Alderman examined the seal, which was unbroken, and the notarized documentation surrounding it. She nodded. James handed me the envelope. I opened it at the witness stand. Margaret's handwriting, neat and slanted to the right the way it always had been, the way I had watched it for 38 years on grocery lists and birthday cards and the tide charts she used to annotate for me. I read it aloud because Susan asked me to, and because I wanted everyone in that room to hear it. "Bobby, if you're reading this in a courtroom, I'm sorry I'm not there beside you. I noticed something at Thanksgiving 2 years ago. Marcus made a comment about the property value and what it would be worth once things changed, and something about the way he said it made me cold. He didn't say if things changed. He said once. I started paying attention after that. I couldn't find enough to bring to you, and I was running out of time. The cancer was moving faster than the doctors had told me to expect. I had a choice between worrying you with suspicion or making sure someone was in place to protect you when the time came. I chose Claire. She has her grandmother's instincts and her grandfather's stubbornness, and she will not let them take what you built. I need you to know that I spent 42 years as your partner, and I spent the last months of my life making sure that partnership didn't end with someone else winning. You are the most capable, clear-headed, frustrating man I have ever loved. Don't you dare let anyone tell you otherwise. All my love, always, Margaret." The courtroom was silent except for the ventilation and, somewhere behind me, Claire trying not to cry. James Whitmore placed additional documents on the judge's bench. Margaret had copied emails, printed records, made handwritten notes about conversations and dates. Everything Claire had found, Margaret had suspected first and begun to document herself. Judge Alderman sat with those documents for a long moment. When she looked up, the quality of her attention had shifted entirely. "I have been on this bench for 19 years. She looked at Marcus, at Thomas, at Bernard Phillips in the gallery. What I have observed in this courtroom today is not the case of a man in decline. It is a case of calculated exploitation, carried out over more than a year, against a man who worked 4 decades to build something and who trusted his family to work alongside him." She set down the papers. "The petition for emergency guardianship is denied in its entirety. Mr. Hale has demonstrated complete competency. I am ordering an immediate freeze on all assets held by Coastal Legacy Holdings, LLC, pending a full forensic accounting. Mr. Hale is granted immediate restoration of full access to all Hale Marine Properties accounts and records. I am referring both Mr. Marcus Webb and Mr. Thomas Hale to the Essex County District Attorney's Office for investigation of fraud, forgery, and financial exploitation. I am also referring Bernard Phillips to the Massachusetts Board of Bar Overseers. Her gavel came down. Susan said softly, "It's done." Claire was already beside me. I held my daughter for a long time in the aisle of that courtroom while Helen's small voice from somewhere in the gallery said, "Dad, is Grandpa okay?" And I heard Marcus tell her yes, in a voice that had no steadiness left in it at all. 6 weeks later, FBI Special Agent Renata Caldwell sat across from me at my kitchen table. She laid out the full picture in the methodical way investigators do, without drama, just facts arranged in sequence. 14 forged signatures over 11 months. The stamp, the buried transfers, the LLC structure, the development deal. Total assets moved from Hale Marine Properties into Coastal Legacy Holdings amounted to just over $41 million in property value. Of that, approximately $37 million had been frozen before transfer could be completed. The remaining $4 million had been moved through a series of accounts and was currently the subject of an active recovery effort. Thomas Hale cooperated fully in exchange for a reduced charge. He had been in it from the beginning, drawn in by Marcus's certainty and the size of the numbers. His plea agreement included 22 months in federal custody, 8 years of probation, and full financial restitution. Marcus did not cooperate. His attorney argued for home confinement on the basis of a clean prior record and his role as a father. The prosecution pushed hard. The judge, who heard the criminal case, sentenced Marcus Webb to 4 years in federal prison, 15 years probation, complete restitution, and a permanent prohibition from serving as an officer or director of any legal entity. He was in custody by the time the spring boats came in. Bernard Phillips lost his license to practice law in Massachusetts. The board's ruling cited his direct participation in a scheme targeting a vulnerable adult, though I noticed, as Claire had, that the word vulnerable required a certain amount of correction. I was not vulnerable. I had simply trusted people I should not have trusted. That is a different thing. On a Sunday in April, I drove to Bearskin Neck and walked down to the water. The harbor was full of lobster boats heading out. The light was flat and silver, the way it gets in early spring here, before the tourists come and the water turns a color that makes people want to paint it. I thought about Margaret standing at the stern of our first boat, a 22-foot Mako I'd bought in 1989 for less than I should have admitted to her. She'd seen immediately that I'd overpaid, and she had loved it anyway, and she had never mentioned the price again because she understood that some things cost what they cost, and the number is not the point. She had spent her last months protecting me. She had been dying, and she had chosen to use her remaining time building a defense she would never see deployed. I could not decide whether that was the saddest thing I had ever known or the most extraordinary. Both, I decided. Both at once. Claire brought Helen to Sunday dinner that week, just the three of us. And Helen set the forks on the wrong side again, and I still didn't correct her. After dinner, Helen fell asleep on the living room couch, and Claire and I sat on the porch in the cold with our coffee. "The Marina's back on solid footing," she said. "Bill says revenues are up from last year." "Good people running it," I said. "Took me too long to find them, but we got there." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to see Marcus before sentencing?" I'd been thinking about that. He was my son-in-law. He had sat at my table. He had pushed Helen on the tire swing in the backyard, and I had watched it happen and felt only the ordinary satisfaction of a man whose family was whole. Both things were true, and sitting with both of them was the hardest part of all of this. "Not before sentencing," I said finally. "Maybe after. I haven't decided yet." Claire nodded. She didn't push. Inside, I could hear Helen shifting on the couch, half asleep, murmuring something. Claire looked through the window at her daughter, and then back at me. "She's got Mom's timing," Claire said. "Always wakes up right when the quiet gets too quiet." I smiled and said nothing and drank my coffee in the cold April air of the coast I'd grown up on and intended to die on. In my own time, by my own choosing. That is the thing they had not understood, Marcus and Thomas and everyone who had decided that 67 years meant the end of something. It is not the end. It is the part where you finally know which fights are worth having and how to win them. It is the part where the people who love you have been watching long enough to know when you need them. It is the part where everything your wife built in silence becomes the wall that holds when everything else tries to fall. Age is not weakness. I had been saying that to myself since the day I walked into that courthouse, and standing on that porch in the spring dark with my daughter beside me and my granddaughter asleep inside and the harbor running cold and silver down the hill, I finally believed it completely. Margaret had known I would. She had bet everything on it. She had been right,